Picture this. It's 1938, and a room full of the Soviet Union's top military engineers are staring at a young metallurgist like he's lost his mind. What did he just say? Make armor thinner? In a world racing to build the thickest, most impenetrable steel fortresses on wheels, Mikhail Koshkin just walked into the Kharkov Design Bureau and proposed something that sounded like industrial suicide. But here's the thing. What seemed like madness would soon become the single most important innovation in armored warfare history. Before we dive into this incredible story, drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. Are you a history buff? A tank enthusiast? Or just someone who loves stories about underdogs who changed the world? Let's get into it. Now, to understand why Koshkin's idea was so revolutionary, you need to understand what the world of tank design looked like in the late 1930s. Every nation, Germany, France, Britain, the United States, was locked in an arms race, and the philosophy was brutally simple. Bigger is better, thicker is stronger. When a shell hits your tank, you want enough steel between that explosion and your crew to absorb the impact. It was Newton's laws applied to warfare. Action, reaction, force meets force. The Germans were already developing their panzer divisions with this exact mindset. Reinforce, fortify, outlast. But there was a problem with this approach that nobody wanted to talk about. The thicker you made your armor, the heavier your tank became. The heavier your tank, the slower it moved. The slower it moved, the easier it was to hit. And the more steel you used, the more resources you consumed. Resources that nations like the Soviet Union, still recovering from revolution and famine, simply didn't have in abundance. So when Mikhail Koshkin, a 35-year-old engineer with intense eyes and a mind that never stopped questioning, stood before his superiors and said, "What if we don't try to stop the shells at all? What if we make them slide off instead?" You can imagine the reaction. Silence, then laughter, then outright dismissal. But Koshkin wasn't some dreamer with his head in the clouds. He'd worked his way up from the factory floor, spending years studying metallurgy, physics, and the brutal mathematics of projectile impact. He'd watched test after test where shells punched through flat armor like a knife through butter. And he'd noticed something that everyone else seemed to ignore. Angle matters. When a shell strikes armor at a perpendicular angle, 90 degrees, straight on, it delivers maximum force to a single point. All that kinetic energy concentrates into one devastating impact. But when that same shell hits at an angle, something fascinating happens. The effective thickness of the armor increases without adding a single gram of steel. A 50mm plate angled at 60 degrees becomes equivalent to 100mm of vertical armor. But that wasn't even the most brilliant part. At steep enough angles, shells don't just penetrate less effectively, they ricochet, they bounce off, they glance away like stones skipping across water. Koshkin had discovered that you could turn physics itself into a weapon. So he assembled a small team of believers. Alexander Morozov, a brilliant young designer who saw the elegance in Koshkin's mathematics. Nikolai Kucherenko, an engineer who understood that innovation required risk. Together they started working on what would become the A-20 prototype, the predecessor to the T-34. But they faced a wall of resistance that would have crushed lesser men. The head of Soviet tank production, a man named Pavilion Pavlov, was a traditionalist who'd built his career on conventional designs. He looked at Koshkin's sloped armor concept and saw only complications. "How do you manufacture curved plates at scale?" he demanded. "How do you weld angles that severe without creating weak points? How do you fit a turret on a hull that's slanted like a pyramid?" These weren't unreasonable questions. Soviet factories were already struggling to meet production quotas for existing tank models. Retooling entire assembly lines for an unproven design could set them back years. And with Nazi Germany growing more aggressive by the month, they didn't have years. They might not even have months. But Koshkin had an answer for everything. For manufacturing concerns, he proposed simplifying other aspects of the design to compensate. Wider tracks to distribute weight, a more efficient engine layout, a roomier interior despite the angled hull. For welding challenges, he worked directly with factory metallurgists to develop new techniques. And for the skeptics who said sloped armor would create internal space problems, he built detailed mock-ups showing how crew efficiency could actually improve with the redesign. Still, approval remained elusive. The Soviet military bureaucracy was notorious for its caution, especially after Stalin's purges had created an atmosphere of fear. Nobody wanted to be the official who championed a radical design that failed, so Koshkin did something extraordinary. He decided to bypass the official channels. In late 1939, with war clouds gathering, he and his team worked around the clock, often sleeping at the factory, skipping meals, pouring everything into a full-scale prototype. They used their own initiative, called in favors, and operated in what could only be described as a gray area of authorization. What they were doing was technically insubordination. In Stalin's Soviet Union, that could mean a one-way trip to Siberia, or worse. Finally, in January 1940, the prototype was ready. The A-34, which would soon be designated the T-34. It sat in the factory yard, its sloped glacis plate catching the weak winter sunlight at aggressive angles, its wide tracks looking almost comically oversized compared to contemporary designs, its diesel engine, another Koshkin. Innovation, rumbling with a different sound than the gasoline engines everyone else used. Now Koshkin faced his greatest challenge: convincing the decision-makers. A demonstration was scheduled at the Kubinka Proving Grounds outside Moscow. The entire Soviet military-industrial leadership would be there. Marshal Kulik, who'd been skeptical from the start. Engineers from competing design bureaus who'd love nothing more than to see this upstart fail. And representatives from the Kremlin itself, men who reported directly to Stalin. The atmosphere on the day of the demonstration was glacial. Temperatures below freezing, snow on the ground, and a cold reception from the assembled officials that matched the weather. Koshkin stood there in his worn coat, watching as his life's work was prepared for judgment. The tests began. Mobility trials first. The T-34 raced across rough terrain, its wide tracks distributing weight so efficiently it barely sank into soft ground where heavier tanks would have bogged down immediately. It climbed obstacles that other tanks couldn't scale. It accelerated faster, turned sharper, covered ground with a speed that made the observers exchange glances. But speed wasn't enough. Armor was the question. Armor was everything. They rolled the T-34 into position at the firing range. A captured German 37mm anti-tank gun, the same weapon that was shredding Soviet BT tanks on the Finnish front, was positioned at combat distance. The first shell was loaded. And this is where the tension becomes almost unbearable. Because if Koshkin was wrong, if his mathematics were off by even a small margin, if the welds failed or the angles weren't quite right, his career was over. Possibly his life. The gun fired. The crack echoed across the frozen range. And the shell bounced off. It hit the sloped glacis plate of the T-34, and instead of punching through, instead of creating the catastrophic penetration everyone expected, it deflected upward. The impact scar was visible, yes, but the armor held. More than held. It had turned the projectile away. The silence that followed was deafening. You could have heard a pin drop on that frozen proving ground. Marshal Kulik stepped closer, examining the impact point with his own eyes, running his gloved hand over the scar, checking for penetration that wasn't there. The engineers from rival bureaus looked like they'd seen a ghost, because what they'd just witnessed shouldn't have been possible. Not with armor that thin. Not with a tank that mobile. The physics didn't match their understanding of how armor was supposed to work. Except it did. Koshkin's physics, Koshkin's mathematics, Koshkin's crazy idea. They fired again. A second shot, then a third, then a fourth. Different angles, different ranges, maximum velocity impacts. And again, the shells ricocheted, glanced off, failed to penetrate. One shot actually bounced so dramatically it sailed over the tank entirely. By the fifth shot, something had shifted in the crowd. The skepticism was giving way to something else. Not quite belief yet. These were hard men, made cautious by decades of disappointment, but a dawning realization that they might be witnessing something unprecedented. Then they brought out heavier guns. The 45mm anti-tank cannon. The same weapon mounted on Soviet tanks. At close range, this gun could penetrate 40mm of vertical armor. The T-34's glacis plate was only 45mm thick. By conventional wisdom, this should be a close call. The gun fired. The shell struck the sloped armor, and once again it ricocheted away, leaving only a scar. The effective thickness created by the angle had turned 45mm into the equivalent of 90mm of vertical plate. Koshkin's mathematics had predicted this exactly, but seeing it in reality was something else entirely. Now here's where the story takes an even more dramatic turn. Because you'd think at this point, Koshkin would be celebrating. You'd think the Soviet military would immediately order mass production. But remember, this was 1940. This was Stalin's Russia, where caution was survival and enthusiasm could be dangerous. The official response was measured, cautious, bureaucratic. Interesting results. Requires further evaluation. We'll schedule additional tests. Koshkin could feel his opportunity slipping away. He knew war was coming. He could read the intelligence report same as anyone. Hitler's Germany was preparing for something massive, and every day of delay was another day Soviet soldiers would face panzers in inferior tanks. So Koshkin made another audacious decision. He proposed a winter trial, a brutal endurance test where the T-34 prototypes would drive from Kharkov to Moscow, demonstrate to Stalin himself, and then drive all the way back. Over 2,000 kilometers through some of the harshest winter conditions imaginable. In March 1940, when the roads were rivers of mud, from melting snow when conventional vehicles could barely move, Koshkin led a small convoy of T-34 prototypes on this epic journey. They drove through blizzards. They crossed rivers where the ice was breaking up. They navigated roads that weren't really roads at all, just suggestions of paths through endless forest and steppe. And the T-34s performed flawlessly. Where other vehicles would have broken down within days, Koshkin's design kept moving. The diesel engines proved more reliable than gasoline. The wide tracks conquered terrain that would have trapped narrower designs. The sloped armor wasn't just brilliant defensively, it was structurally efficient, creating a stronger hull with less weight. When they finally reached Moscow, covered in mud, exhausted but triumphant, they received word that Stalin himself wanted to see the demonstration. This was the moment Koshkin had been working toward. Not just approval from military bureaucrats, but the attention of the one man who could order immediate mass production. The demonstration at the Kremlin was everything the Kubinka tests had been, but with higher stakes. Stalin watched with those cold, calculating eyes as the T-34 maneuvered, as shells bounced off its armor, as it proved every claim Koshkin had made. And Stalin, whatever else you might say about him, recognized strategic advantage when he saw it. The order came down. Begin mass production immediately. Retool the factories. Train the workers. The T-34 was now the Red Army's priority. Koshkin had won. His crazy idea had become official Soviet policy. But victory came at a terrible personal cost. The winter trial, the weeks spent in freezing conditions pushing his prototype to the limit, had destroyed Koshkin's health. He'd been suffering from pneumonia throughout the journey but had hidden it, refusing to stop, knowing that any delay might doom the project. By the time they returned to Kharkov, he was gravely ill. In September 1940, just months after, finally receiving approval for his life's work, Mikhail Koshkin died of pneumonia. He was just 32 years old. He never saw his design in mass production. He never witnessed the T-34 in actual combat. He never knew that his innovation would be called the single most effective tank of World War II, that military historians would credit it as a decisive factor in the Soviet victory over Nazi Germany, that his mathematical principles would influence armored vehicle design for generations to come. But here's what happened next, and this is where Koshkin's genius truly revealed itself. When Operation Barbarossa began in June 1941, when 3 million German soldiers crashed across the Soviet border with the largest invasion force in human history, the Wehrmacht expected to face the same inferior Soviet tanks they'd heard about from intelligence reports. They expected their 37mm and 50mm anti-tank guns to shred Soviet armor, the way they'd shredded French and Polish tanks. They expected their Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs to dominate the battlefield. Instead, they encountered the T-34, and German after-action reports from those early battles read like horror stories. Our shells simply bounce off. The Bolshevik tanks are impervious to our anti-tank weapons. They appear out of nowhere, moving at speeds we didn't think possible for armored vehicles, and our rounds deflect harmlessly. German tank commander Hans von Luck later wrote, "The T-34 was the finest tank in the world. Our panzers could only penetrate its armor at extremely close range, from the sides or rear, while it could destroy us from 1,500 meters. General Heinz Guderian, one of Germany's most respected tank commanders, reported directly to Hitler that the T-34 represented a fundamental crisis for the Wehrmacht. Its combination of sloped armor, mobility, firepower, and reliability was something German engineering hadn't anticipated. The psychological impact on German troops was devastating. For the first time, Wehrmacht soldiers, who'd been told they possessed the world's best equipment and would achieve quick victory, faced a Soviet weapon that was simply better. The famous German 80mm anti-aircraft gun was pressed into anti-tank service, largely because smaller caliber weapons were ineffective against T-34 armor. German tank design was hastily revised, leading eventually to the Panther and Tiger tanks, both of which incorporated sloped armor, a direct acknowledgement that Koshkin had been right. But by the time Germany could field these improved designs in significant numbers, they were already losing the war. The Soviets were producing T-34s by the thousands, using the efficient design that required less steel and less manufacturing complexity than German tanks. Koshkin's innovation wasn't just brilliant. It was strategically scalable. Now, you might be thinking this is just a story about engineering, about a clever guy who did the math right. But it's so much more than that. Because look at what Koshkin actually did. He questioned fundamental assumptions that everyone else accepted as truth. When the entire world said, thicker armor is stronger armor, he asked, but what if we're thinking about this wrong? When experts with more experience and more credentials dismissed his ideas, he didn't back down. He built a proof of concept. When bureaucracy and caution threatened to bury his innovation, he took personal risks that could have destroyed his career, his freedom, even his life. When his body was failing and he could have stopped, could have let someone else finish the work, he pushed through because he understood the stakes were bigger than himself. Mikhail Koshkin embodied something we've lost in many of our modern institutions: the courage to challenge consensus, the humility to let physics and mathematics speak for themselves rather than ego and hierarchy, and the vision to see beyond immediate obstacles to transformative possibilities. And here's what makes his story even more poignant. Koshkin never sought glory. He wasn't trying to become famous or rich. He wasn't even particularly interested in military affairs beyond the technical challenge. He was a metallurgist who saw an inefficiency and couldn't let it go. He was a problem solver who happened to be working on a problem that would affect millions of lives. In a different time, in a different place, his mathematical insight about angled surfaces and projectile deflection might have been applied to architecture or aerospace or any number of peaceful applications. But history placed him in a moment when his particular genius was exactly what was needed. The T-34 went on to become the most produced tank in history. Over 84,000 were built between 1940 and 1958. It fought not just in World War II but in the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and dozens of other conflicts. Some are still in service today. Every single one of those tanks, every soldier who survived because a shell bounced off sloped armor instead of penetrating, every battle where superior mobility made the difference. They all trace back to one man's crazy idea and his refusal to accept that conventional wisdom was the only wisdom. But there's an even deeper lesson here, one that resonates far beyond tank warfare or even military history. Koshkin's story is about the power of first principles thinking. Instead of asking, how do we do what everyone else does but slightly better? The incremental approach that dominates most institutions. He asked, what are we actually trying to achieve? And what's the most effective way to achieve it? He stripped the problem down to pure physics. A shell has kinetic energy. That energy needs to be dispersed or redirected. The conventional approach tried to absorb the energy with mass. But absorption requires enormous amounts of material and creates diminishing returns. You can always build a bigger gun. Deflection, however, uses the projectile's own energy against itself. It's a form of mechanical aikido. And the beauty is that deflection scales differently than absorption. You can't infinitely increase armor thickness, but you can optimize angles to maximize deflection probability across a wide range of projectile types. This is genius-level thinking, seeing the problem from an entirely different frame of reference. And think about the environment in which this happened. This wasn't some well-funded Silicon Valley startup with venture capital and the freedom to fail. This was Stalin's Soviet Union during the purges, where failure could mean execution, where showing too much initiative could get you labeled a wrecker or saboteur, where the safe path was to keep your head down and follow orders. The courage it took to not just have an unconventional idea, but to actively pursue it against institutional resistance in that environment. It's almost incomprehensible. Koshkin put everything on the line, including his life, for an idea he believed in. That's not just engineering excellence, that's moral courage of the highest order. And yes, he paid the ultimate price. His health destroyed by the brutal winter trial, dying at 32, never seeing the full impact of his work. There's a tragic poetry to that. But would he have done anything differently? Based on everything we know about Koshkin's character, the answer is probably no. He understood that some contributions matter more than individual comfort, or even individual survival. Now contrast that with how many of us approach challenges in our own lives. How often do we accept conventional wisdom simply because everyone else accepts it? How often do we silence our own insights because they contradict what the experts believe? How often do we choose the safe path, the incremental improvement, the comfortable consensus, instead of asking the harder question, what if we're thinking about this completely wrong? Koshkin's story challenges us to be braver, not reckless. Notice he built his case methodically with mathematics and prototypes and demonstrations, but brave enough to question, to propose alternatives, to persist when the first response is dismissal. In our careers, in our relationships, in our understanding of ourselves, there are probably flat armor assumptions we're making. Conventional approaches that work okay but aren't optimal. What would it mean to apply Koshkin's first principles thinking to our own challenges? What would it mean? To ask not, how do I do this better, but what am I actually trying to accomplish, and is this even the right approach? Here's another dimension to this story that's worth considering. Koshkin's innovation was ultimately about efficiency and elegance. Sloped armor wasn't just more effective, it was more efficient. It achieved superior results with less material, less weight, less complexity in certain aspects, even while introducing complexity in others. There's a principle in engineering and design called elegance, solutions that are both simple and powerful, that solve problems with minimal waste and maximum effectiveness. Koshkin's sloped armor was elegant. It worked with physics rather than against it. And there's a lesson there about how the best solutions often aren't about applying more force or more resources, but about applying resources more intelligently. Working smarter, not harder, as the cliché goes, but Koshkin actually did it, with mathematical precision and physical proof. How many problems in our own lives are we trying to solve by throwing more resources at them, more time, more money, more effort, when what we actually need is a more elegant approach, a different angle of attack, a first principles rethinking of the challenge itself? And let's talk about the redemption arc embedded in this story, because it's subtle but powerful. The initial antagonists, the skeptical engineers, the cautious bureaucrats, the traditionalist military officials, they weren't villains. They were operating within a framework that made sense to them. Thicker armor had worked, incremental improvements had worked. Why risk everything on an unproven concept? Their caution was, in its own way, responsible. But what Koshkin showed them, what he forced them to confront, was that responsibility without vision is stagnation, that caution can become cowardice, that sometimes the truly responsible choice is to take a calculated risk on something better. And many of those initial skeptics, once they saw the proof, became advocates. Marshal Kulik, despite his initial doubts, pushed for rapid deployment. Engineers who'd laughed at the concept became its champions. The system that resisted Koshkin ultimately embraced his vision, not immediately, not easily, but genuinely. That's a kind of redemption. It shows that institutions, despite their inertia, can change when confronted with undeniable evidence. But it also shows that change requires someone willing to be unpopular, to absorb the criticism, to do the work even when support is absent. Koshkin was that person. He didn't wait for permission to be right. He proved he was right, then permission followed. There's a lesson there for anyone trying to drive change in any organization. You need both the courage to act and the rigor to build an undeniable case. Passion without proof is just noise. But proof without the passion to push it through bureaucracy dies in a filing cabinet. Koshkin had both, and that combination is what transformed tank warfare. Now let me bring this home with a final reflection. The T-34's sloped armor saved countless lives, changed the outcome of the most destructive war in human history, and influenced military design for generations. But Mikhail Koshkin didn't live to see any of that. He died in obscurity. Known only to a handful of colleagues, his name lost to most of history until decades later, when Soviet archives opened and military historians pieced together who actually designed the T-34. He didn't get the medals, the recognition, the glory. He got pneumonia and an early grave. So why did he do it? Why push so hard? Why risk everything? Because some people are driven not by recognition, but by the conviction that they've seen something true, something important, something that needs to exist in the world even if they won't be around to see it flourish. That's a rare and precious kind of integrity. It's easy to be courageous when you know you'll be celebrated for it. It's easy to innovate when you know success will bring wealth and fame. But to pursue an idea knowing you might fail, knowing you might be punished for trying, knowing that even if you succeed the credit might go to others or be lost entirely, that requires something more than courage. It requires a kind of selfless dedication to truth and improvement that most of us can barely imagine. And yet, that's exactly what the world needs more of. Not self-promoting thought leaders who package conventional wisdom in new jargon. Not incrementalists who make safe bets and claim credit loudly, but people like Mikhail Koshkin who see problems clearly, think deeply, act bravely, and care more about the solution than the recognition. So if you're watching this video and you feel inspired, here's what I want you to take away. You probably know something that others don't see yet. You probably have an insight, a solution, an approach that contradicts conventional wisdom in your field, your company, your community. The question is whether you'll have the courage to pursue it. Not recklessly. Koshkin didn't just say sloped armor is better, he proved it mathematically, built prototypes, demonstrated it repeatedly, but courageously, persistently, despite skepticism and resistance. The world doesn't need another person quietly agreeing with the consensus while secretly thinking, there's got to be a better way. The world needs people who will stand up and say, here's a better way, here's why it works, here's the proof. Will it be comfortable? No. Koshkin's path wasn't comfortable. Will you be celebrated immediately? Probably not. Koshkin wasn't. Will you face criticism, dismissal, resistance? Absolutely. But if you're right, if you've done the work, if your idea truly is better, then eventually the truth wins. Not always in your lifetime, not always with proper credit, but the truth has a way of proving itself. And here's the beautiful final twist to this story. While Koshkin never knew the impact of his work, we do. We know that his crazy idea worked. We know that shells bounced off T-34 armor exactly as his mathematics predicted. We know that Soviet soldiers survived battles they would have lost in flat-armored tanks. We know that German engineers scrambled to copy his innovation. We know that modern armored vehicles, from tanks to personnel carriers to even spacecraft, use variants of his angled armor principle. We know that Mikhail Koshkin, the humble metallurgist who questioned conventional wisdom, changed the world. His name might not be famous, but his legacy is welded into the very structure of modern military technology and, more broadly, into the principle that the best solution isn't always the conventional solution. That sometimes the answer is to completely rethink the question. That physics, mathematics, and logic will eventually triumph over hierarchy, tradition, and institutional inertia. If someone is brave enough to, do the work and persistent enough to prove the case. So before you go, I want you to do something. Hit that like button if this story moved you or taught you something. Drop a comment telling me what flat armor assumption you're questioning in your own life. What conventional wisdom you think might be wrong. What different angle you're considering. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that courage and competence can change the world even when recognition is absent. And subscribe to this channel because we're dedicated to finding and telling stories like this. Stories of individuals who saw clearly, thought deeply, and acted bravely to make things better, whether they got credit or not. These are the stories that matter. These are the people who move humanity forward. And the more we remember them, the more we honor them, the more we might be inspired to follow their example. Because somewhere right now, there's another Mikhail Koshkin, someone with an idea that seems crazy, that contradicts conventional wisdom, that could change everything if only they have the courage to pursue it. Maybe that person is you. Maybe your sloped armor insight is waiting to be proven. Maybe the world needs exactly what you see, even if nobody else sees it yet. Don't wait for permission. Do the work, build the proof, make the case. And when shells start bouncing off, when your idea proves itself, remember that the satisfaction isn't in the recognition. It's in knowing you saw something true and brought it into existence. That's the legacy Mikhail Koshkin left us. That's the challenge he offers every generation that follows. Are we brave enough, dedicated enough, clear-thinking enough to question assumptions? To pursue truth over comfort? To build something better even if we never see the full impact? I think we can be. Koshkin proved it's possible. Now it's our turn to prove it again. Thank you for watching. Now go build something impossible.